There are moments in your life that act as a fulcrum, a single point upon which the entire weight of your past and the vast, terrifying potential of your future seem to balance. They rarely announce themselves. There is no thunderclap, no dramatic swell of music. They arrive disguised as something ordinary, something forgettable, like the final scene of a mediocre action film on a Tuesday night. For me, that fulcrum was the unassuming space on a worn corduroy couch, a gap of no more than 3 inches that had, over the course of 2 hours and 17 minutes, ceased to exist. It was the sustained, unwavering warmth of my roommate Julian's hand, resting not on his own leg, not on the cushion between us, but pressed gently, deliberately, against the denim of my thigh. It was a simple, silent thing, a point of contact in the flickering dark of our living room, and yet it was the loudest thing I had ever experienced. My entire world had constricted to that single patch of heat, a quiet declaration that I was utterly unequipped to interpret, and even more unequipped to ignore. I had spent the better part of the last 3 years learning to ignore things when it came to Julian. It was a survival mechanism, a form of internal architecture I had carefully constructed, room by silent room. We had met through a mutual acquaintance at a gallery opening, a world I inhabited and one he was only visiting. I was there to support a friend whose photographs were on display. He was there because the friend's sister was someone he was casually seeing at the time. I remember seeing him across the crowded room, a beacon of easy energy in a sea of performative intellectualism. He wasn't looking at the art with the studied intensity of the other patrons. He was looking at the people, a small, amused smile playing on his lips. He moved with a kind of unthinking grace, a confident physicality that came from years of college soccer, a past life he sometimes talked about with a fond, distant nostalgia. When our mutual friend, Mark, finally dragged him over to introduce us, Julian had shaken my hand with a firmness that was startlingly genuine. His eyes, a shade of hazel that seemed to borrow color from whatever he was near, had met mine without a flicker of pretense. He'd asked me about my own photography, not with the polite disinterest I was used to, but with a focused curiosity that made me feel, for a moment, like one of the artworks on the wall, something worth studying. 2 months later, my lease was up, and through a series of fortunate coincidences, Mark mentioned that Julian was looking for a new roommate. His previous one was moving in with a long-term girlfriend, leaving a sun-drenched second bedroom available in a pre-war apartment that was far nicer than anything I could have afforded on my own. I remember the anxiety that coiled in my stomach when I went to see the place. It felt like an audition, not just for a living space, but for a proximity to him that I already knew was dangerous. The apartment was filled with his presence. A well-worn leather armchair, a stack of programming manuals next to a collection of classic sci-fi novels, a ridiculously complex espresso machine that looked like it belonged in a high-end cafe. It was a space that reflected him perfectly, practical and technical on the surface, but with an undercurrent of warmth and imagination. He'd offered me a beer, and we'd spent an hour talking, not about rent or utilities, but about film and hiking trails and the specific, soul-crushing despair of a corrupted hard drive. By the end of the conversation, he'd simply said, "So, when do you think you can move in?" As if it were the most foregone conclusion in the world. And so I moved in. I built my life in the quiet spaces he left behind. My room became my sanctuary, filled with the scent of darkroom chemicals, stacks of photo books, and the orderly clutter of my cameras and lenses. The living room was our shared territory, a neutral ground where our lives overlapped. In the beginning, I was cautious, maintaining a respectful distance. I was the quiet observer, a role I had perfected over a lifetime. I learned the rhythms of his life, the way he'd pace the length of the apartment while on a conference call, gesticulating wildly at an invisible audience. I learned that he hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when he was deep in concentration, coding for his consulting job. I learned that he was a terrible cook but a meticulous cleaner, leaving the kitchen spotless after every one of his culinary disasters. He was a creature of contrasts, A man who could spend 12 hours debugging a complex algorithm and then lose his keys 3 times in a single day. My feelings for him grew in the silence, like a photograph developing slowly in a tray of solution. It wasn't a sudden crash, but a gradual saturation of color, an image coming into focus that had, perhaps, been there all along. It was in the way his laugh could fill the entire apartment, a loud, uninhibited bark of genuine amusement that made me smile from my room. It was in the small, thoughtful gestures, like him bringing me a coffee from his favorite place on a Saturday morning without me asking, remembering my exact, complicated order. It was in the moments I'd catch him looking at one of my photographs that I'd hung in the hallway, his expression unguarded and thoughtful, and I would feel an irrational surge of pride that was all out of proportion to the act. He was, I had to admit to my own heavily guarded heart, magnificent. And he was, as far as I knew, completely and utterly straight. His dating life was a series of bright, brief flashes. Women who were smart and funny and beautiful, who would appear for a few weeks or a few months, their laughter echoing in our living room, their perfume lingering in the hallway long after they'd left. I learned to make myself scarce during those times, retreating to my room or finding a sudden, urgent need to go for a long walk with my camera. I became an expert in the art of polite retreat, of being present but not intrusive. I'd exchange pleasantries with them in the kitchen, offer a friendly, non-committal smile, and then vanish. Each one felt like a small, sharp confirmation of the unbridgeable distance between us, a reminder of the fundamental architecture of our relationship. I was the roommate, the friend, the quiet, reliable fixture in the background of his life. And for a long time, I convinced myself that was enough. It was a good friendship, a great one, even. He respected my quiet nature, and I grounded his restless energy. We had an easy, unspoken understanding. It was a delicate ecosystem, and I knew that my secret feelings were a foreign species that, if introduced, could destroy it all. So I kept them locked away, in a dark room of their own, undeveloped and unseen. The shift began subtly, a change in the atmospheric pressure of our apartment that I felt long before I could identify its source. It was late autumn, the season when the city seemed to exhale, shedding its summer vibrancy for a more melancholic, withdrawn beauty. Julian had been working on a massive project for a new client, a financial tech firm that was demanding and notoriously difficult. The confident energy that usually radiated from him began to dim, replaced by a thrumming, nervous tension. The easy laughter became rare, the late-night pacing more frequent. He started coming home later and later, his face etched with a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. He looked brittle, like a photograph that had been left in the fixing bath for too long, the image starting to bleach out at the edges. I remember one night in particular. I was in the kitchen, making tea, when he came through the front door well after midnight. He didn't say hello, just dropped his laptop bag on the floor with a heavy thud that echoed in the quiet apartment. He walked over to the counter, leaned against it with both hands, and just hung his head, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He stood there for a full minute, breathing slowly and deliberately, as if he were trying to manually regulate his own heartbeat. I didn't say anything. I just finished making my tea, then quietly placed a second mug on the counter, filled it, and pushed it gently towards him. He looked up, his eyes seeming to focus on me for the first time. The gratitude in his gaze was so raw, so unguarded, it felt like a punch to the gut. He whispered a "Thanks, Leo," that was thick with exhaustion, and we stood there for a while, drinking our tea in a shared, weary silence. It felt different from our usual comfortable quiet. This was a silence born of necessity, a space where he didn't have to perform, didn't have to be the charming, capable Julian. He could just be, and he had chosen to be that way with me. A week later, the project imploded. He didn't tell me the details, but I pieced it together from the hushed, angry phone calls I overheard from my room. There was a security breach, a data leak, and the client was blaming his team. It wasn't his fault, but he was the consultant, the outside face, and he bore the brunt of the fallout. The contract was terminated. Just like that, the immense, all-consuming structure of his professional life was gone, leaving a gaping void. For the first few days, he was a ghost in our apartment. He'd sleep until noon, wander into the living room, and just stare out the window for hours. His phone, which was usually a constant source of buzzing and ringing, sat dark and silent on the coffee table. The confident, extroverted man I knew had retreated so far into himself that I wasn't sure he knew the way back out. It was during that time that the ritual began. It started with a simple request. I was settling onto the couch one evening, planning to read, when he emerged from his room, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He looked lost. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "You mind if I put a movie on? I can't. I can't deal with my own thoughts right now." I, of course, said yes. He put on some mindless sci-fi movie, something with lots of explosions and a paper-thin plot. He sat on the far end of the couch, a fortress of pillows and blankets around him, and I sat on mine, the book resting unread in my lap. We didn't speak a word for the entire film, but when the credits rolled, he didn't get up. He just sat there, staring at the screen. "Thanks," he said finally. That was better. It was the first time I'd seen a flicker of the old Julian in over a week. The next night, he asked again, and the night after that. The movie nights became our new routine, an unspoken agreement. It was a form of shared convalescence. He needed the distraction, the noise that would drown out the silence of his failure. And I just wanted to be there. I wanted to be the steady, quiet presence in the corner of his collapsing world. I told myself it was just friendship, the most basic form of human decency. But a more honest part of me, the part one kept locked away, knew it was more. It was a chance to be near him in a way I hadn't been before, to witness a vulnerability he had never shown anyone else. It was a selfish, dangerous thought, and I tried to push it down every time it surfaced. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the geography of the couch began to change. The three-cushion expanse that had separated us began to shrink. One night, he sat not on the far cushion, but on the middle one. The buffer zone was gone. I could feel the heat radiating from him, could smell the faint scent of the soap he used. My senses were on high alert, every nerve ending firing. I spent the entire movie in a state of suspended animation, my body rigid, my breathing shallow, hyper-aware of the inches that separated his arm from mine. He seemed oblivious, lost in the film, but I was acutely aware of the invisible current that now flowed between us. It was a silent, tectonic shift, the landscape of our friendship rearranging itself under my feet. Then came the blanket. It was a cold night, the old radiator in our building hissing and clanking with a valiant, but ultimately futile effort. I had my own small throw blanket over my legs. Julian, who had emerged from his room in just a t-shirt and sweatpants, was shivering. He watched me for a moment, then asked, his voice hesitant, Is that big enough to share?" My heart hammered against my ribs. It was such a simple, practical question. A question any friend might ask another. But it felt loaded, a doorway opening into a room I wasn't sure I was ready to enter. I heard myself say, "Yeah, of course," my voice sounding unnaturally calm. He shifted closer, and I unfolded the blanket, draping it over both of our laps. And just like that, a new boundary was dissolved. We were now contained within a single, shared space, a small tint of warmth in the cool air of the living room. Under the cover of that soft, knitted wool, the potential for accidental contact multiplied exponentially. A stray foot, a shifting knee. Each brush of his leg against mine was an electric shock, a tiny event that I would replay and analyze for hours after he had gone to bed. I started to think of our living room as a darkroom. Each night, we would sit in the near-total blackness, the only light coming from the screen, and I would wait. I would wait for the image of what we were becoming to resolve itself. Was this just friendship, developing along predictable lines of comfort and support? Or was it something else, a latent image I had always suspected was there, finally being brought to the surface by the chemical bath of his crisis? I was terrified of exposing it to the light too soon, of tearing open the door and flooding the room with the harsh reality of my own hopes, ruining the delicate process forever. So I waited in the dark with him, patient and silent, my pulses steady, rhythmic beat counting down to a moment I couldn't yet see. The first time he fell asleep on me, it was an accident. Or at least, it had the perfect alibi of being an accident. We were watching an incredibly slow, ponderous historical drama that he had chosen, and about an hour in, I felt a gradual, increasing weight against my shoulder. I glanced over. His head was slumped against me, his breathing deep and even. His hair, which was usually perfectly styled, was a mess, and a few strands tickled my neck. My first instinct was to tense up, to gently nudge him awake. It felt too intimate, a trespass on the carefully curated distance I had maintained for years. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. He looked so peaceful, so utterly without defense. The taut lines of stress around his eyes had softened, and his mouth was slightly parted. He was just asleep, and he had chosen my shoulder as his anchor. So I sat there, motionless, for the next hour and a half, my arm going numb, my neck getting stiff, until the movie ended. I didn't dare move a muscle, scarcely dared to breathe. It was the most uncomfortable I had ever been, and the most profoundly content. When the credits finally rolled and the room filled with a soft, gray light, he stirred, blinking slowly. He pulled away, rubbing his eyes. "Oh man," he mumbled. "Did I fall asleep on you?" Sorry, he didn't quite meet my eyes. "It's fine," I said, my voice a little hoarse. "You were clearly exhausted." He just nodded, mumbled a good night, and disappeared into his room, leaving me alone on the couch with the ghost of his warmth on my shoulder and a heart that was beating far too fast. It was no longer an accident after that. It became part of the ritual, not every night, but often enough that it became a new, unspoken norm. He would lean his head against my shoulder with a soft sigh, a gesture that was both a surrender and a request. A request for comfort, for stability, for a solid place to rest in the turbulence of his own mind. And I would grant it every time. I became a student of his sleep, of the subtle shifts in his weight, the soft sounds of his breathing. I learned that he sometimes twitched in his sleep when a scene in the movie had a sudden, loud noise. I learned that he smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. These were details I had no right to know, intimate pieces of information I was gathering under the guise of friendship. The line between caring for a friend and indulging my own secret yearning had become so blurred as to be invisible. I was living a double life on my own couch, one version of me the supportive roommate, the other a silent lover committing every detail of the man beside me to memory. I tried to rationalize it, to frame it in a way that wouldn't shatter me. He was lonely. He was going through a crisis. He was seeking physical comfort in the same way someone might hug a pillow or curl up with a pet. It was platonic. It had to be. He was Julian. Julian who dated women. Julian who had never, in the 3 years I had known him, given any indication that he was interested in men. To believe otherwise was to set myself up for a devastating fall. And yet, there was a deliberateness to his actions that gnawed at my carefully constructed logic. He never fell asleep on the arm of the couch or on a pillow. He only ever fell asleep on me. He would shift closer, under the blanket, and there would be a moment of quiet settling, a purposeful alignment of his body against mine. It felt less like a collapse from exhaustion and more like a docking maneuver, a ship seeking a specific, trusted harbor. My photography began to change. I had always been drawn to landscapes, to quiet, empty spaces, to the subtle interplay of light and shadow on unpeopled structures. But now, I found myself obsessed with the human form. I spent hours in my room looking through books by portrait photographers, studying the way a hand could convey more emotion than a face, the way the space between two bodies could tell a whole story. I started a new project, a series of self-portraits. But they weren't of my face. They were close-ups of my hands, my shoulder, the side of my neck. I was trying to capture the feeling of being touched, the memory of his weight, the ghost of a presence. The photographs were stark, high-contrast black and white. They were images of loneliness and longing, an attempt to translate the screaming silence of my internal world into something tangible. They were pictures of the space he occupied, even when he wasn't there. And then came the night of the hand. It was a Tuesday, a day with no particular significance. We were watching some forgettable action movie, the kind with a predictable plot and a constant barrage of explosions that served as a perfect smokescreen for the real drama unfolding on our couch. We were in our usual formation, under the blanket, his head resting on my shoulder. He'd been quiet all day, more withdrawn than usual, and I could feel a low-grade tension humming off him. About halfway through the film, he shifted. It wasn't the usual sleepy adjustment. He pushed himself up slightly, moving his head from my shoulder. For a heart-stopping second, I thought he was pulling away, that the fragile bubble of our ritual had finally burst. I braced myself for the cold air that would rush into the space he was about to vacate. But he didn't move away. Instead, he just resettled, and in the process, his left hand, which had been tucked under the blanket, came to rest on the cushion between us. My eyes were locked on the screen, but my entire consciousness was focused on that hand. It was so close. The knuckles of his index finger were just barely brushing against the rough denim of my jeans. I could feel the heat of it, a tiny, localized star in the darkness. I thought, this is it. This is the moment he realizes. He'll feel the contact, register the intimacy of the position, and pull away with a quick, awkward apology. I held my breath, waiting for the retreat. But it never came. The seconds stretched into a minute stretched into 5. The car chase on the screen escalated, but the world on the couch had fallen completely still. And then he moved. It was a minuscule motion, a shift so small it might have been imagined. His fingers uncurled slightly, and his hand slid forward, just a single, deliberate inch, until the length of his hand, from the heel of his palm to the tips of his fingers, was resting firmly against my thigh. The world stopped. The sound from the television speakers faded into a dull, meaningless roar. My blood seemed to turn to static in my veins. This was not an accident. This could not be rationalized as a sleepy, unconscious gesture. His head was no longer on my shoulder. He was awake, sitting upright beside me, his eyes on the screen. This was a choice. A conscious, calculated placement. A hand, laid down like a gauntlet or a prayer, I couldn't tell which. My mind raced, trying to process the sheer volume of information being transmitted through that simple point of contact. The pressure was gentle, but firm. The warmth seeped through my jeans, a deep, penetrating heat that felt like it was sinking right into my bones. I was pinned, not by the weight of his hand, but by the weight of its meaning. What did it mean? Was it a test? A question? A mindless gesture of comfort that meant everything to me and nothing to him? My internal monologue became a frantic, desperate debate. One voice, the voice of hope, whispered that this was it. This was the signal, the image finally resolving in the dark. It was a silent confession, an admission of something he couldn't yet say out loud. But another voice, the voice of fear and self-preservation I had cultivated for years, screamed that I was a fool. I was projecting my own desires onto him. He was just comfortable. He felt safe with me, and this was just an extension of that platonic safety. To interpret it as anything more was to walk willingly off a cliff. I was a photographer, a professional observer of light and shadow, and yet, in that moment, I was completely blind, staring into an abyss of ambiguity. He didn't move his hand for the rest of the movie. Not through the climactic fight scene, not through the cheesy, triumphant finale, not even as the credits began to roll. It just stayed there, a steadfast, silent presence. My leg began to cramp from the rigidity with which I held it, terrified that the slightest movement from me would break the spell. We sat there in the flickering light of the credits, the list of names scrolling upwards, a silent testament to the passage of time. The silence in the room was deafening. I was so aware of my own breathing, of the frantic beat of my own heart. I was certain he could hear it, that he could feel it vibrating through the couch cushions. Finally, the credits ended. The screen went black. The room was plunged into a deeper darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the streetlights outside our window. His hand was still there. "Well," he said, his voice sounding rough, strained. That was a movie. It was such a mundane, absurd thing to say, given the circumstances. It was like commenting on the weather during an earthquake. I couldn't form a reply. My throat was tight. My tongue felt thick and useless. He finally lifted his hand, and the sudden absence of its warmth was a physical shock, a patch of cold spreading across my leg. He stretched, his arms reaching for the ceiling, and let out a long, theatrical yawn. It was a performance, a carefully constructed pantomime of normalcy. "I'm beat," he said, getting to his feet. "Gonna turn in." He didn't look at me. He just started towards his bedroom. He got to the doorway of the living room and paused, his back still to me. "Hey, Leo," he said, his voice much quieter now. "Yeah." I managed to croak. He hesitated for a long moment. I could see the tension in his shoulders, even in the dim light. "Thanks," he said finally. "For, the movie." And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the darkness, with the phantom sensation of his touch burning on my skin and a million unanswered questions screaming in the silence of my mind. The next few nights were a masterclass in tension. The ritual continued, but it was different now. The hand had become a character in our nightly drama. It was the Chekhov's gun of our living room. Each night, I would wait for it. He would settle in beside me. We would share the blanket. He would lean his head on my shoulder, and then there would be a pause. A long, agonizing pause where I could feel him debating with himself. Sometimes, his hand would rest on the cushion between us, a breath away from my leg, and stay there all night, a promise unfulfilled. On other nights, after an eternity of waiting, it would make the journey, sliding over to rest against my thigh, and my world would once again contract to that single point of contact. He was testing the waters, I realized. Or maybe he was testing me. He was pushing the boundary just a little bit further each time, waiting to see if I would pull away, if I would flinch, if I would give any sign that this was not okay. And I never did. I sat there, a statue of feigned indifference, while my insides were a chaotic storm. I was giving him nothing, no reaction, no encouragement, no sign of rejection. I was a blank wall he was throwing his questions against, and I had no idea what answers, if any, were bouncing back. I knew it couldn't go on like this. The ambiguity was becoming corrosive, eating away at the foundations of our friendship. The comfortable silence we once shared was now thick with unspoken things. I felt like a photograph that was being held in the developer for too long, the image growing darker and darker, the details being lost, threatening to dissolve into a black, meaningless void. Something had to happen. Something had to be exposed to the light. I just didn't have the courage to be the one to do it. I was terrified that the image I so desperately wanted to see was just a figment of my imagination, a chemical ghost, and that the reality was a stark, empty white. The reality was that I was about to lose my best friend. The breaking point came on a Friday. We had just finished a film, a quiet, introspective indie drama that had left the room feeling heavy with emotion. The credits were rolling, a melancholic piano score filling the silence. His hand had been on my leg for the past hour, a familiar, agonizing weight. The music faded, the screen went black, and we just sat there. Neither of us made a move to get up. The performance of normalcy had been abandoned. There was no yawning, no stretching. There was only the thick, palpable silence. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I could hear my own heart, a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of my ribs. He was the one who broke it. He lifted his head from my shoulder and turned to face me. In the dim light from the window, I could just make out the shape of his face, the dark pools of his eyes. His hand was still on my thigh, his thumb stroking the denim in a slow, rhythmic motion that sent shockwaves through my entire body. "Leo," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper, a fragile, tentative thing. I didn't trust my own voice, so I just made a small, questioning sound in the back of my throat. He swallowed, and I could see the movement of his throat in the gloom. He seemed to be gathering all the courage in the world. He took a breath. "Would it be okay?" he started, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He stopped, took another breath, and tried again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, as solid and as real as the couch beneath us. It was not a proposition. It was not a joke. It was a plea. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever heard. All the frantic analysis, all the fear, all the second-guessing, it all just evaporated. The complex equation I had been trying to solve for months had been reduced to a simple, binary choice. Yes or no. Stay or flee. Risk everything or lose everything. The fulcrum had arrived. He was waiting, his eyes searching my face in the dark, his hand frozen on my leg. I could see the fear in his posture, the way he was braced for rejection, for the laughter that would dismiss his question as a momentary lapse of sanity. He had just handed me a match and a stick of dynamite, and was trusting me not to light the fuse that would blow our entire world apart. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The words were trapped somewhere between my heart and my throat. So instead, I just leaned forward, closing the small gap that remained between us. I watched his eyes widen slightly in the darkness, a flicker of disbelief, of relief, of terror. And then I closed my own eyes and gently pressed my lips against his. It was not a passionate kiss. It was not hungry or demanding. It was tentative. It was soft. It was, more than anything, a confirmation. It was the answer to a question he had been asking silently for weeks, and the answer to a question I had been too afraid to even form in my own mind for years. It was just a brief, chaste pressure, a moment of startling warmth and stillness. But it was everything. When I pulled back, he let out a shaky breath, a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. His hand on my thigh finally tightened, his fingers gripping the fabric of my jeans. "Oh," he whispered, as if he had just discovered a fundamental truth of the universe. Okay. The morning after was a landscape of blinding, awkward daylight. The intimacy of the darkness had vanished, and in its place was a harsh, unforgiving clarity. I woke up first, my mind a jumble of elation and sheer, unadulterated panic. What had we done? What happened now? I crept out of my room and into the kitchen to make coffee, my movements stiff and unnatural, as if I were a stranger in my own home. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. I was halfway through grinding the beans when I heard his bedroom door open. I froze, my back to him, my hand still on the grinder. I heard his footsteps hesitate in the hallway. I could feel his presence behind me, a heavy, uncertain weight in the air. The comfortable, easy silence of our mornings was gone, replaced by a thick, unbreathable tension. "Hey," he said, his voice raspy with sleep. I forced myself to turn around, to assemble my features into an expression of casual calm that I absolutely did not feel. "Morning," I replied, my voice coming out surprisingly steady. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was focused on a fascinating spot on the floor just to the left of my feet. He was wearing an old, faded t-shirt and plaid pajama pants, and he had never looked more like a stranger to me. I have to run," he said, still staring at the floor. "Early meeting I forgot about. It was a lie, and we both knew it. It was Saturday. His contract was gone. He had nowhere to be. He was running, not to a meeting, but from me. From what had happened on the couch. My carefully constructed hope from the night before began to crumble, turning to a cold, heavy dread in the pit of my stomach. "Oh," I said, keeping my voice light. "Okay. Well, have a good meeting." He just nodded, grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door, and left without another word, the sound of the front door closing behind him echoing like a final judgment in the silent apartment. He didn't come home that night. A single, terse text message arrived around 7 in the evening. "Staying at Mark's. Need to clear my head." I stared at the message until the words blurred. Clear my head. It was a cliché, a polite, cowardly euphemism for I made a huge mistake, and I don't know how to face you. The dread in my stomach curdled into a bitter, familiar despair. I had been a fool. A complete and utter fool. I had mistaken a moment of lonely, confused vulnerability for something real. I was a port in his storm, a temporary harbor, and now that the worst of his personal crisis was passing, he was setting sail again, leaving me beached and broken. I had allowed myself to hope, and this was the price. The friendship, the one thing I had treasured and guarded so carefully, was now in ruins. The delicate ecosystem was destroyed, poisoned by that one hopeful kiss. I spent the next 2 days in a state of numb misery. The apartment felt vast and empty, haunted by his absence. Every room held a memory of him, his laughter, his pacing, his humming. The couch was an unbearable sight, a crime scene. I couldn't even look at it. I retreated to my room, my own personal darkroom, and tried to lose myself in my work. But I couldn't focus. The images I tried to edit all seemed flat and lifeless. The silence I usually craved was now oppressive, filled with the ghosts of conversations we would never have. I was angry. Angry at him for his cowardice, for initiating something he had no intention of seeing through. And I was angry at myself, for being so weak, for letting my guard down, for believing, even for a moment, that I could be something more than the quiet, reliable roommate. He came back on Monday afternoon. I heard his key in the lock, and my entire body went rigid. I stayed in my room, my door closed, listening to the sounds of him moving around the apartment. He unpacked a bag. He opened the refrigerator. He was trying to pretend everything was normal, that he had just been away for the weekend. The cowardice of it all finally broke through my despair and solidified into a cold, hard resolve. I couldn't live like this. I couldn't live in the ruins, pretending the earthquake hadn't happened. I needed to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, I needed to hear it. I needed the final, clean break so I could begin the long, painful process of sweeping up the rubble of my own heart. I opened my door and walked into the living room. He was standing by the window, staring out at the street, his back to me. He must have heard me, but he didn't turn around. "Julian," I said, my voice low but firm. He flinched, but still didn't face me. "We need to talk." He let out a long, weary sigh. "Leo, I don't know." I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to run and hide and pretend nothing happened. You started this. Whatever this is, you owe me the decency of finishing it." I took a step closer. "If you're going to tell me it was a mistake, that you were just confused or lonely or whatever other excuse you've come up with, then just say it. Say it to my face. Rip the bandage off. But don't you dare treat me like a ghost in my own home." That finally made him turn around. His face was a wreck. He looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were red-rimmed, and the lines of stress were back, deeper than before. He looked lost, and young, and so incredibly scared. The anger in me wavered, replaced by a familiar, aching tenderness. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just shook his head, a look of profound self-loathing on his face. He sank down into the leather armchair, the one that was his sacred territory, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders started to shake, and then I heard it, a sound I had never heard from him before. A quiet, choked sob. My resolve shattered. I walked over and knelt on the floor in front of him, my anger completely gone, replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching concern. "Julian? Hey, what's wrong? Talk to me." He slowly lowered his hands, and his face was wet with tears. "I'm so sorry, Leo," he whispered, his voice thick and broken. "I'm so sorry. I'm such a coward." "Sorry for what?" I asked, my voice gentle. "For the kiss? For leaving?" He shook his head frantically. "No, not for the kiss. The kiss? The kiss was the most honest thing I've done in my entire life." He looked at me then, his hazel eyes swimming with a confusion and a fear that was heartbreaking to witness. "I'm sorry for this, for how I'm handling this. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo." And then it all came pouring out of him, a torrent of confession and confusion. He talked about the pressure he'd always felt to be the successful one, the confident one, the one who had it all figured out. He talked about his project failing, and how it had felt like his entire identity had been erased overnight. He talked about the women he'd dated, how it had always felt like he was playing a role, following a script that he'd been handed but had never truly understood. He said it never felt real, not in the way the quiet nights on the couch with me had felt real. He talked about the comfort, the safety, the feeling of being able to finally, truly breathe. He hadn't understood it at first. He had just craved it, a drowning man craving air. And then, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I started craving you. Not just the comfort. You. I'd find myself thinking about your smile when I was in a meeting. I'd be listening to a song and thinking about whether you would like it. And it terrified me, because it didn't fit. It didn't fit with the person I was supposed to be. The person I've always been. He looked down at his hands. Putting my hand on your leg, it was a test. I was testing myself. I was thinking, if I do this completely insane, undeniable thing, it will feel wrong. It will feel weird. And my brain will finally snap back to normal. He looked up at me, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. But it didn't feel wrong, Leo. It felt like coming home. And when you kissed me back, it was like my whole world shifted on its axis. And I panicked. I ran. Because I have no idea how to be this person. I have no idea what this means. I listened to it all. Every painful, confusing, honest word. And as I listened, I felt the last of my fear and anger dissolve, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of clarity. I wasn't an experiment. I wasn't a mistake. I was his home. He was just as lost and terrified as I was, maybe even more so. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. When he finally fell silent, his confession hanging in the air between us, I reached out and gently took his hand. His fingers were cold. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at me, his eyes full of questions. You don't have to have it all figured out, Julian, I said, my voice quiet but sure. You don't have to know what this means right now. I don't either. I gave his hand a gentle squeeze. All I know is what you just said. It felt like coming home. For me too, a fresh wave of tears welled in his eyes. But this time, they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. He squeezed my hand back, a silent, grateful pressure. So what do we do? He whispered. I offered him a small, watery smile. I don't know, I said. We just start here. Together. Okay. He nodded, a real, genuine smile finally breaking through the sadness on his face. Okay, he said. We did not solve everything in that one conversation. There was no magical moment of perfect understanding. But the door, which had been slammed shut, was now open. We spent the rest of that day talking, really talking, for the first time. We laid out all the unspoken things, all the fears and assumptions that had built up between us like walls. It was messy and awkward, and at times, incredibly painful. But it was honest. It was the demolition phase, clearing away the rubble of our old relationship to make way for a new foundation. That night, there was no movie. We just ordered takeout and ate in a comfortable, exhausted silence in the kitchen. When it was time for bed, we stood in the hallway, a new, uncertain space between us. He looked at my closed bedroom door, then at his. Good night, Leo, he said softly. Good night, Julian, I replied. He started to turn towards his room, then hesitated. He turned back, closed the distance between us in 2 quick steps, and gave me a brief, gentle kiss, as soft and as tentative as the first one had been. Just so you know, he whispered against my lips. That wasn't a mistake either. The days that followed were a process of rediscovery. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The grand, sweeping gestures of romance you see in movies were absent. Our story was being written in the margins, in the small, quiet moments. It was in the way he started making coffee for both of us in the morning, leaving a mug on my desk before I was even out of bed. It was in the way I'd come home to find he'd framed one of my photographs, one of the self-portraits of my shoulder, and hung it in the living room. It was in the way we started holding hands, a simple, grounding act, while walking down the street, a silent declaration to ourselves, if not yet to the world. The movie nights returned, but they were different. There was no more subtext, no more agonizing analysis. The blanket was just a blanket. The closeness was just closeness. His head on my shoulder was no longer a request, but a statement. His hand on my thigh was not a question, but an answer. It was easy. It was right. One evening, about a month after our conversation, I was in my room working. My door was slightly ajar, as it usually was. I heard Julian come home, heard him moving around in the kitchen, and then his footsteps came down the hall. He stopped outside my door. I looked up from my computer. He was just standing there, in the doorway, watching me with a soft smile on his face. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, a look of such open, unguarded affection that it made my heart ache in the best possible way. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he reached out, not to knock, but to gently push the door all the way open, flooding the frame with his presence. It was a simple gesture, but it felt deeply symbolic. No more closed doors. No more hiding. He walked in, came over to my desk, and leaned down to kiss the top of my head. "Just wanted to see you," he said, and then he went to his own room, leaving the door between us wide open. A fulcrum is not just a point of balance. It is the point from which you begin to lift. It is the solid ground upon which you can build something new. That night on the couch, the night of the hand, had been terrifying. It had been a moment where everything could have shattered. But it had also been the beginning. It was the point where the weight of our unspoken feelings became too much for the old structure of our friendship to bear, and we were forced to find a new, stronger way to hold it. We were building that new structure day by day, in the quiet moments, in the easy silences, in the shared cups of coffee and the open doors. We were not defined by a single, dramatic moment of confession, but by the thousand small, honest moments that followed. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned, finally, to create together.